You may be noticing these changes but not paying enough attention to them. And while you are buying yourself a coffee or a new model of smartphone, our world, our planet is seeking to get rid of man, of humanity. Yes, you heard it right. Our Earth is destroying us. I managed to save myself, to escape from the clutches of death, but I had to pay a high price for it. And now I'm going to tell you something that won't make the news, but that every person on this planet should know. My name is Steven. For the last 7 years, I've been working at a station codenamed Cole 68. We were humanity's watchdogs, peering into the soul of our planet, measuring the heartbeat of the Earth in a struggle to understand what was happening to our home. And yet, despite our vigilant surveillance, we missed the signs. Cole 68 was a sprawling outpost of modern civilization, perched on the edge of the ocean, with a backdrop of unyielding, raw mountains. In terms of location, we were remote, an enclave of scientific inquiry teetering on the edge of the known world. The station held hundreds of us. Climate scientists, technicians, security personnel, all living months at a stretch in isolation. Our nearest neighbor, a small town that barely existed on maps, lay a couple days' drive away along a solitary, winding, mountainous road. 2 days ago, a storm swept in from the ocean. It was as if nature had thrown a tantrum, unwilling to be probed and examined any longer. Rain battered our buildings, wind screamed, threatening to uproot us from our moorings and cast us into the churning sea. On the night the storm began, Robert, one of our security guards, disappeared. Robert was an imposing figure. Standing over 6 feet tall with broad shoulders and a stern, unsmiling face, he was both respected and slightly feared. He was a quiet man, spent his days patrolling the station's corridors and manning the surveillance cameras. His evenings were passed in the solitude of his quarters or the quiet corner of the canteen, sipping black coffee. His disappearance was as abrupt and unexpected as the storm that raged outside our walls. In the frosty daylight, we gathered around the building where Robert lived. His absence at the morning roll call had sent a wave of unease through the station. Robert was not a man prone to tardiness. His discipline was the stuff of legend. Brad, the head of security, was a stark contrast to Robert. Where Robert was quiet and introverted, Brad was loud and jovial. His booming laughter often echoed through the station, a comforting reminder of humanity in our cold, sterile environment. Brad had organized the search for Robert. He met my questioning gaze, a shadow of worry clouding his usually merry eyes. "We've looked everywhere, Steven," he said, his voice husky. "No trace of him. It's like he just vanished." "But what about the cameras, Brad? Surely they would have caught something," I said, glancing at the array of security cameras mounted high on the exterior of the buildings. Brad shook his head. "The storm messed with the surveillance system. Half the cameras are down and the rest, the footage is all static. And worse, our comms are out. We're cut off, Steven. First time in all my years here that this has happened." A shiver coursed through me that had nothing to do with the icy wind. The thought of being cut off, isolated from the world with a potential threat looming over us, was disconcerting. With a heavy sense of foreboding, we entered Robert's quarters. The small, Spartan room was neat, everything in its place. His bed was made, his uniform folded meticulously on a chair, his boots lined up against the wall. There was no sign of a struggle, no blood, no unusual odor, nothing that suggested any kind of foul play. "People don't disappear into thin air," Brad's voice echoed in the small room, shattering the silence, especially not without anyone noticing. My mind churned over our predicament, my scientist's brain struggling to make sense of the nonsensical. "Could he have deserted?" I asked Brad, voicing my thoughts. Brad looked at me, his eyes mirroring the bewilderment I felt. "Deserted to where, Steven? The nearest town is miles away, and with these mountains and the rough coastal region, there's no way he could make it on foot." I nodded, knowing Brad was right. The station was a self-contained bubble in the middle of nowhere. If someone were to lose their mind and try to escape, there was nowhere to run to. Living in isolation could sometimes cause people to behave oddly. Over the years, we'd had a few instances of employees acting strangely, but those issues were quickly addressed. Either the person in question was sent to our resident psychologist or given leave to go home. Most of the time, this solved the problem. But this was different. Robert had shown no signs of distress or abnormal behavior, according to his colleagues. A heavy sigh escaped me as I considered our situation. There seemed to be only 3 possibilities. I started, drawing Brad's attention. The first one is that he indeed deserted, despite it being highly unlikely. Brad shook his head vehemently. I knew Robert, Stephen. He was a tough man. Duty meant everything to him. Ignoring his interjection, I continued. The second possibility is that he was kidnapped and is being held somewhere on the station. Given that our security personnel, including Robert, are all ex-military with combat experience, the most likely suspects would be your men, Brad. Brad's face blanched at the suggestion, but I could see he was considering it, his mind already running through his team, evaluating them. But there's a third, more chilling option, I said, feeling a cold shiver snake down my spine as I voiced my fears. What could be worse? Brad asked, his voice barely a whisper. The third option is that he's dead. Maybe he was murdered and the body hidden away, with the murderer cleaning up any trace of the crime. The gravity of the statement hung in the air between us. Our eyes met, the grim possibility mirroring in our expressions. Outside the station, the storm continued to howl like a wild beast, gnashing its teeth against the reinforced walls of Coal 68. It was a deafening, relentless symphony that echoed the chaos in our hearts. We were marooned in our technological bastion, a beacon of progress, reduced to a glorified cage, surrounded by elements that cared little for our scientific prowess. As the storm raged, it became increasingly hazardous to venture outside. The security protocols were amplified, turning our station into a fortress. We were prohibited from being alone, forced to adapt to a system of mutual surveillance where we had to keep an eye on each other, checking for deviations in behavior. Our living quarters were fortified with additional sensors and alarm locks, while our security personnel were reassigned from external patrol to internal surveillance. 3 days of exhaustive search yielded no trace of Robert. I found myself continuing with my work, grasping the familiarity of climate data and algorithms, attempting to impose some semblance of order to the chaos that was rapidly engulfing our lives. In the solitude of my office, I toyed with the unsettling notion that Robert might have indeed run away. Despite the bleak improbability, I was almost ready to convince myself of this far-fetched possibility. It was then that Brad walked into my office, a pall of dread hanging over him like a shroud. After an agonizing silence, he finally spoke, his voice a hollow echo. 2 more people have disappeared, 2 more gone and still no trace. But these weren't guards. They were a station staffer and a scientist. There was no common thread that bound them to each other or to Robert. They had vanished from different locations, last seen at different times. As Brad and I traversed the eerily quiet station, examining their living quarters, frequent haunts, and last known locations, we came up empty-handed. The atmosphere at the station had turned funereal. Under the relentless glare of artificial light, Brad and I moved to the next course of action: witness interviews. As per Brad's amended protocols, each employee had been assigned a partner. Interviews are a painstaking process, especially when the participants are colleagues, friends even. But we had to wear our professional masks, forcing ourselves to be objective observers. Yet the interviews bore no fruit. The pairs of the 2 recent victims reported the same unnerving fact. The victims had been with them until they weren't. They disappeared as if swallowed by thin air, slipping away without drawing attention. The staffer was missing when his partner woke up, and the scientist vanished the moment his partner turned to fix a malfunctioning antenna. Battered by the storm, none of the victims had shown any signs of distress or unusual behavior before they disappeared. We were stuck in a dead end, no leads to follow, no clues to decipher. In the end, Brad made a call. Despite the howling storm and the risks it posed, a small group would leave the station. Brad would lead them to the nearest town to relay our dire situation to the central headquarters, hoping for further instructions, guidance. The group returned the same evening, their faces etched with frustration and anxiety. Brad informed me about the state of the only road leading out of our station. It was as if the earth itself was conspiring against us. The path through the mountains was impassable, burdened by a rock slide. The stone bridge, our lifeline over the furious river, was in ruins. We were trapped. The storm had turned our sanctuary into a prison. We had 2 options: restore communication, or wait for the storm to pass. Both seemed equally improbable under the circumstances. The storm carried on, casting us in an unending cycle of dayless nights. Rain lashed against the panes, as if the world outside was trying to get in. The wind screamed its fury. The torrential downpour drowned out every other sound. It was as if nature itself was caught in a maddening symphony, an orchestra of chaos and fear. In the grim procession of days that followed, the specter of disappearance claimed 4 more of us. As before, they left no trace, like shadows fading with the light. Our little accountability system, our lifeline of hope, was proving woefully insufficient. A day later, 3 more vanished, 2 stalwart guards and a scientist. In the 2 days that followed, 8 more joined the ranks of the missing. We found nothing, no trace, no clue. Nothing but the yawning void they left behind. Fear continued to gnaw at us, an insidious plague working its way through our ranks, sprouting into unchecked panic. One evening, I found myself on a large terrace in one of the station's towers, shielded from the rain by a generous canopy. The wind was cold, the world around harsh and uninviting. Yet I stood there, staring out into the black abyss of the ocean, waves undulating like a living, breathing entity. Its rhythmic rustle against the rocky shore was the only sound breaking the storm's chaotic symphony. Lost in my thoughts, I was roused by the arrival of Brad. He looked just as worn as the rest of us, his eyes bearing the telltale signs of sleepless nights and a mind burdened with impossible puzzles. Breaking the silence, Brad voiced the dreadful theory gnawing at the back of our minds. "We've scanned every inch of this station, ventured through the hellish landscape outside, combed the coastal plains, and even braved the treacherous mountains. But we found no sign of them, not even a single drop of blood. We seem to have looked everywhere, yet there's one place we haven't: the water. It's the only logical conclusion." The black waves, indifferent to our plight, continued their hypnotic dance, swallowing his words. The vast, unknown expanse of the ocean bore silent witness to our suffering, its fathomless depths hiding our worst fears. It took me a moment to find my voice, and when I did, it echoed the haunting conclusion Brad had drawn. "Yes, I've been thinking the same, yet it doesn't add up. If there is a killer who's disposing of bodies in the sea, wouldn't someone have noticed? Dozens have disappeared. But the beach, we have to keep a close eye on it." Brad nodded, his gaze fixed on the churning waves, just as mine was. We stood in silent accord. As long as I could remember, migraines had been my steadfast companions. They came in waves, capricious as a stormy sea. At times they'd recede, leaving me untouched for months on end. But in their wrath they'd surge again, relentless and merciless, reducing me to a spent shell. The past few months at Col 68 had been a blessing. My affliction had seemingly taken a vacation, but it chose now, amidst the storm and disappearances, to make a grand return. Each pounding heartbeat echoed in my skull, amplified 1,000-fold, the pain resonating in unison with the crashing waves outside. Dehydrators offered scant relief. I was forced to turn to the more potent analgesics from the station's medical supplies. My refuge in these tumultuous times was the terrace, its cool breezes and salty sea air serving as a balm to my throbbing head. As I stood there, lost in contemplation, a staff member and a scientist emerged onto the terrace. I was near the entrance, blocking their path inadvertently. I regarded them with a puzzled frown, then stepped aside. The 2 moved past me, seemingly oblivious to my presence. They moved towards the edge of the terrace, climbed over the balustrade, and jumped. The staff member landed with surprising agility, while the scientist tumbled onto the rocky shore with a sickening crunch. The wind, a relentless harpy, carried the echoes of shattering bones into the night. I rubbed my temples, my gaze still fixed on the undulating black canvas of the sea. The staff member made his way towards the waves. The scientist, despite his gruesome fall, dragged himself the same way. Step by step, the staff member waded deeper into the sea, the cold water first swallowing his legs, then his waist, chest, until he was entirely consumed. The scientist too reached the water's edge, his silhouette gradually disappearing into the cold waves. They had joined the ranks of the missing, lost to the merciless sea. I stood, watching the macabre spectacle unfold, my migraine pounding in sync with the pulsing sea. It was then that I found myself considering the sea, its icy embrace, the peaceful oblivion it offered. It was an allure as old as humankind, a siren's call promising solace from the pain and chaos. Yet the thought of swimming in the storm-tossed sea in this weather was preposterous, even to my addled mind. Shaking my head, I resumed my vigil over the beach, ready to spot any anomaly. It was in the wake of this grim realization that reality snapped back into focus, a rubber band stretched to its limit. What just happened? Wasn't I alone just now? Why did they... The thought trailed off as a sudden, unbearable wave of pain coursed through my skull, the world around spinning into a blurry mess. I crumbled to the ground, succumbing to the all-encompassing blackness of unconsciousness. I awoke to a sea of white light. My brain screamed in protest. Each throb of my pulse echoed like a cannon shot. A form swam into focus. Brad's face, drawn and pale, hovered above me, his lips moving in a slow, purposeful manner. I couldn't decipher his words. The sounds were an unintelligible murmur against the relentless pounding in my skull. A figure in white, the nurse, stood at the edge of my blurred vision. Brad's words started making sense as my foggy consciousness regained clarity. I had been found unconscious on the terrace. I had been out for nearly 2 days. In that time, 22 people had vanished, like smoke on the wind. He had managed to recover the surveillance footage, but it showed nothing out of the ordinary. My sight began to focus. The world around stopped being a blur of bright, painful light. I blinked, struggling to adjust. I felt my back slick with sweat, the sheets beneath me damp with it. Turning my gaze to Brad, I recoiled. His skin was a sickly gray, mottled with greenish growths. They looked like algae, spreading across his face and body in splotches, clustered into horrific blisters. The sight was stomach-churning. The nurse, standing silently by, mirrored Brad's condition. The horror that bloomed within me was as unbearable as the physical pain. I stared at Brad, the shock morphing into raw terror. My gut clenched, bile rising in my throat. Brad caught on to my reaction, confusion rippling across his algae-laden face. "What's wrong?" he asked, concern etched in his voice. His cluelessness about his grotesque appearance was somehow more terrifying. "Do you not see anything different about yourself?" I managed to choke out. He shook his head in bewilderment. I requested a mirror, my voice wavering with trepidation. As the nurse handed me a hand mirror, I steeled myself for the revelation. My reflection was a sick parody of the man I used to be. My skin was speckled with greenish growths, much like Brad's, though I wasn't as ashy, and blisters were conspicuously absent. I was infected, but not as severely. The realization felt like a physical blow. I asked to be left alone, my voice a mere whisper. Brad and the nurse, oblivious to their own affliction, left me to my thoughts. Memories surfaced like bloated corpses in a calm lake. The 2 men on the terrace jumping into the sea, their bodies surrendering to the dark waves. At that moment, it had seemed as if I was watching a dream, a hypnotic spectacle that had not stirred any alarm within me. But now, the memory was vivid, grotesque, and terrifyingly real. Why had I dismissed it so nonchalantly? Why hadn't anyone in the station raised a cry of alarm? The realization hit me like a freight train. We were all infected, every single soul aboard Col 68. The virus or bacteria, whatever it was, had silently crept into us, altering not just our bodies but our minds, making us oblivious to the horrifying reality. My head swam with the weight of this revelation. The storm was the cause of it all. It had come uninvited from the unfathomable depths of the ocean, bringing with it a contagion that was beyond our worst nightmares. We were all infected, unknowingly succumbing to the disease that manipulated our minds and morphed our bodies into grotesque representations. We were blind to our own transformation, oblivious to the people leaping into the ocean's cold embrace. But why was I different? Why was I able to break free from the hypnotic influence of the contagion, to remember the macabre incidents that were conveniently forgotten by the others? Lost in these questions, I was startled by a series of muffled thuds coming from outside the infirmary window. A sense of foreboding crept over me, icy fingers closing around my heart. Pushing myself off the bed, I stumbled towards the window. What I saw sucked the breath out of my lungs. Bodies were falling from the station windows like stones, silently hurtling towards the ground in a ghastly procession. Some of them managed to rise, broken but determined, and started limping towards the ocean. Others, their bodies too damaged for movement, dragged themselves inch by excruciating inch towards the dark waves. Among the grotesque parade of the infected, I spotted the nurse, her body twisted in an unnatural angle as she crawled towards the ocean. I pulled away from the window, my heart pounding against my ribcage. I had to find Brad. I had to make him see what was happening. As I dashed out of the infirmary, I saw the other members of the station staff. The greenish growths covered their faces, their bodies, marking them as victims of the invisible invader. An urgent need to warn them welled up within me. But could I make them see? Could I make them believe the horrific truth that the contagion had made us blind to? I wrestled with the thought as I raced towards Brad's office, realizing the futility of my endeavor. To those under the sway of the contagion, my revelations would be the ravings of a madman. I found Brad hunched over his computer screen, engrossed in the surveillance footage from the recovered cameras. His office was a stark contrast to the chaotic scene outside. His back was rigid, the only indication of his focus and determination. The green growths had invaded his face, but his eyes were clear, untouched by the infection. As I stepped into the room, a silent prayer to whatever gods that may be listening formed in my mind. I had to make Brad see, had to break the spell that the contagion had cast over the station. The lives of everyone on Col 68 depended on it. I approached Brad's desk, my gaze flickering to the grainy images playing out on the screen. I watched in helpless horror as the camera caught the station's personnel moving like specters into the thrashing waves, their figures dissolving into the ocean's monstrous expanse. But to Brad, the screen was blank. "Nothing," Brad muttered, pushing himself away from the desk with a sigh of frustration. He glanced at me, a feeble smile playing on his lips. "Glad to see you're walking already, Steve." I felt my throat tighten. He couldn't see. He couldn't see the horror unfolding before us, couldn't see the plague that had marked us all. "Brad," I began, my voice shaky but resolute. There were people in the footage, walking into the ocean, disappearing. I struggled to keep my voice steady, to pour conviction into every word. "We are all infected, Brad. We're covered in these green algae-like growths. It's the contagion. It came with the storm." I told him everything I was thinking, my theory. There were no other logical conclusions. Everything fell into place, and I hoped Brad would understand me, believe me. Brad was silent, his gaze steady on me. For a moment, I dared to hope that he believed me, that he would stand by my side and help me fight this nightmare. But his silence dragged on, and my hope began to wilt under his skeptical gaze. Finally, he rose from his seat, the action seeming to draw a curtain on our conversation. Without a word, he led me out of his office and into the humming corridor of Col 68. He stopped one of the passing security guards, his voice cold and firm. "Take Steve to the safe room. The stress of the situation seems to have gotten to him." The guard, a young man barely out of his 20s, looked between Brad and me, clearly shocked, but he nodded and gestured for me to follow him. I stood there, my gaze locked with Brad's. His eyes held no malice, only pity. I was just a madman to him. The realization hit me like a punch to the gut. He didn't believe me. He saw my desperate pleas for what they were, the paranoid ramblings of a madman. I allowed the guards to lead me away, my body numb, my mind screaming at the injustice of it all. The door of the safe room shut behind me with an ominous thud, the sound echoing in the small room. I was locked away, labeled insane by the very person I trusted to believe me, to see the truth of our predicament. Days turned into nights, and nights turned into days with a monotonous rhythm. My meals were brought in, the migraine medication was administered, and I was left alone in my solitary confinement. Occasionally, Brad would come, his face paler each time, his voice wavering as he mentioned more missing people. Every time he visited, I attempted to explain the situation to him, but my pleas fell on deaf ears. The doctors, the nurses, the staff, no one seemed to understand the gravity of the situation. Or rather, they couldn't. Each of them trapped in their own hypnotic stupor, blind to the reality I had been forced to see. My frustration grew, boiling over into anger. every face that regarded me with sympathetic confusion, every well-meaning word that dismissed my warnings. They were like fuel to the fire. But the blaze of my anger soon turned to ash, smothered by a bleak sense of hopelessness. Then Brad stopped coming. The doctor, possibly foreseeing his own end, left me with an ample supply of medication and vanished. My isolation deepened. The once frequent meals became less and less, until they stopped altogether. The bustling station with its hundreds of personnel had reduced me to a forgotten prisoner. As the silence outside the door of my room grew, so did my resolve. I had to act. After several attempts, I managed to break the lock of my door, the feeling of freedom a bittersweet victory. I stepped out into the corridors, their familiar hum now replaced with a deafening silence. Empty tables, abandoned mugs of coffee, flickering screens playing to an absent audience. It was a ghost town. I wandered into the research lab, the security center, even the employee housing units, all void of life. The only evidence of the station's former occupants were the locked doors and stale meals left untouched. Call 68 was now an abandoned shell, devoid of any human presence. My frantic search only solidified my worst fears. They were all gone, every last one of them. As I made my way through the deserted buildings, I could almost feel their absence, their lives reduced to fading footprints in the sand. I knew where they had all gone, swept away by the hypnotic call of the ocean, the storm's deadly emissary. As I emerged from the desolation of the station, I found myself facing the sea. The storm had passed, leaving behind a clear sky, a deceptive calmness that seemed to mock my desperate situation. With a heavy heart, I turned my back on the station. I walked to my car, the sound of the crashing waves a haunting farewell. I started the engine, the roar shattering the eerie silence. As I drove away from the deserted Call 68, I knew I was leaving behind more than just an empty station. I was leaving behind a horrifying mystery, a tale of a plague from the ocean and hundreds of lives swallowed by its depths.